Hamantakyapi, Nape Chuzapi, Chante Washte. That is a traditional Lakota greeting to all of my relatives and comrades who are listening to this. I greet you all with a handshake and a good heart. My name is Nick Estes. I am a co-founder of the Red Nation, which is a social movement that was founded in 2014 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, specifically to address the economic and social conditions of indigenous people living off reservations. And the reason why we formed was specifically to address a need that wasn't being talked about in the United States. And that need was looking at how many indigenous people had migrated off the reservation because of economic, job security issues, as well as access to healthcare and housing. And so what had happened is that the population living on the reservation slowly has become more urban. And in fact, today, about 4 out of 5 Native people living in the United States don't live on Indian reservations. And in fact, they live in places like cities or urban centers. And they tend to face higher levels of discrimination in housing and in jobs and by the police than they would on the reservation. And so I think this is something that we try to address as the Red Nation. And the name the Red Nation actually comes from a Lakota word, which means Oyate Luta, that is translated into an idea that all the indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere are one nation, the Red Nation, right? And it doesn't have anything to do with skin color. It's just the name that we give everyone who's originally from this hemisphere, that name. So today I want to talk a little bit about the current situation of indigenous people in the United States and some of the challenges that they're facing. I want to begin by looking at a place called northern Minnesota, which is near where I currently live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. There was a historic battle against a Canadian pipeline company called Enbridge, who was building a tar sands pipeline through northern Minnesota, and it went through a lot of indigenous territories. And the reason why the indigenous people, the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe people of northern Minnesota, as well as my people, the Dakota people, stood up against this particular pipeline was because that it had crossed over 200 different waterways, and specifically looking at the amount of carbon that would be emitted into the atmosphere as a result of this pipeline being constructed. And to put that into perspective, the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota would result in more carbon emissions than the entire state of Minnesota. And on top of that, it crosses and threatens very fragile ecosystems, specifically with fresh water. And in fact, the Mississippi River, which is the longest river in the United States, has its headwaters in northern Minnesota, and the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline actually crosses these headwaters. And before it was even operational, the pipeline itself had leaked 5 different times, leaking what they call frack out fluid into these highly fragile ecosystems, these waterways. And to kind of put that into perspective, it's not just an indigenous issue. What the water protectors, as they called themselves, were fighting for, and that included non-indigenous people as well, was clean drinking water for everyone. Clean drinking water should be a human right. And I'm sure many of you know that places like Flint, Michigan, during Obama's tenure, faced an insurmountable drinking water crisis that affected young poor children, specifically young Black children in the United States, causing all kinds of irreparable damage because of lead poisoning. So drinking water in the United States is what we call, a class issue. It's something that not only indigenous people are organizing around, but it's something that the movements for justice in the United States are organizing around, because we all understand that we all drink water, and the Mississippi River Basin drains into the Gulf of Mexico, and it feeds the taps of over 15 million different Americans who depend on the Mississippi River. That doesn't even include the ranchers and the farmers who use the water for agricultural needs. But another kind of interesting element of the Line 3 pipeline struggle is this question of jobs. Because unemployment rates on the reservations are so high, part of the pipeline company's argument was to say that the construction of this pipeline will create jobs. It'll create 5,000 jobs, which is quite a bit, But if we look at, I talked to many of the people, the indigenous people who were living in northern Minnesota, and they were saying, well, nobody's talking about our jobs that are being impacted by the pipeline. And so I got an opportunity to be taken to visit some of the wild rice beds in northern Minnesota. It's the only place that wild rice actually grows in that current state. It requires a specific kind of environment. But one thing that's also important to remember is that the indigenous people in northern Minnesota harvest wild rice. They sell it on a local market, and it supports their cash income for part of the year. And so their job is tied to the rice fields that are being threatened by this pipeline. And to put that into perspective, this year in northern Minnesota, there was a historic drought. Rivers literally dried up for the first time in recorded history. And yet the pipeline company was pumping about 5 billion gallons of fresh water out of these dried riverbeds to finish the construction of something that nobody wanted in the area. And the impact that it had on these wild rice beds was that normally, as I was told by somebody I went and visited, their family in one day gets about 800 pounds of wild rice per harvest. That year, they got half a cup. It was like literally barely fit in the palm of her hand of the wild rice that they got. That is an entire year of income that her family misses out because of that drought. That drought wasn't even caused by the pipeline. That was caused by climate change, right? And so think about that, put that into perspective, that here this community is fighting for the future to stop carbon emissions from this pipeline, but is still dealing with the direct impacts and actually losing its source of income because of the impacts of climate change today, and because of years of pumping carbon emissions into the atmosphere, mostly by the United States, right? And there was a recent study that was published by the Indigenous Environmental Network, which is a social movement here in the United States and Canada. And it came out just in time for COP26, the international meeting of parties to address climate change. And what this report had found is that in the United States and Canada, Indigenous social movements have been challenging, whether it's through direct protests, blockades, or legal challenges, about 25% of the carbon emissions from both Canada and the United States. That's the equivalence of over 400 coal-fired power plants. And they're challenging energy infrastructure, carbon infrastructure, right? Most of this doesn't benefit everyday people. It's built to line the pockets of corporations that are fundamentally going out of business right now because of the way that capitalism is trying to transition from a fossil fuel economy to a so-called renewable economy. And so this is the situation that we're facing, that Indigenous people themselves within Canada and the United States are challenging two of the biggest carbon emitters in the world and responsible for all kinds of war, death, and destruction and sanctions against other countries because of their petroleum reserves or their oil reserves, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Iran. And here the one of the smallest minorities of both of these countries is taking them to task and having an outsized influence on ending fossil fuel extraction as well as emission. And it also impacts how we take care of the land. And so I think this is also an important thing to also remember. Indigenous people are part of the working class. We may not have been fully integrated into the wage economy, but nonetheless, we still do the kinds of jobs that are necessary for the function of life. Like, we protect the water, and we don't just protect it in a spiritual or mystical way. Yes, there are cultural traditions that are tied to it, our languages, our histories, our spirituality is tied to these rivers, and and understanding them as beings and being alive. But fundamentally, our livelihoods are your livelihoods, right, on the planet. We protect about a quarter of the land base on the Earth, which includes about 85% of the world's biological diversity, and this is even in places like the United States. And so this is incredibly important to think about. And on top of that, the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have been devastating for indigenous communities. I used to live in a place called New Mexico, which is in the southwest on the US-Mexico border. And the largest indigenous nation in the United States, the Navajo Nation, which is, its territory is bigger than many states in the US, but it has the biggest population. It was devastated by the COVID-19 pandemic. About one in 100 Navajo people died of COVID-19. And this is the result of many things. It's not because, as it was portrayed in the mainstream news media, that we somehow had a biological inferiority. It's the same thing that they talk about when, Columbus and the colonizers from Europe came, that they brought diseases with them and somehow we were biologically inferior. Well, if we look back on those histories, we understand that the European invaders were waging constant warfare against us, destroying our food supplies, putting us on the run. We were starving, and thus our immune systems were compromised. And so it made us more susceptible to communicable diseases, right? If you just look at Yemen, for example, cholera is the result of an endless US-backed Saudi bombing campaign that has destroyed the country's food and water infrastructure. Yemen people aren't biologically inferior and thus more open to things like cholera, right? It's because of the conditions of war. Well, if we look at the United States and we look at a nation like the Navajo Nation, 30% of the population lives without running water in their homes, and 10% lives without electricity. There are bad roads, malnutrition, and poor living conditions, overcrowded living conditions. And so this creates a recipe to make indigenous people more susceptible to things like COVID-19. However, even despite the years, the decades, the centuries of neglect and colonization by the United States, indigenous people aren't backwards in their thinking and their understanding. They understand that this was a real and serious threat. And so many nations, like my nation, began to create health checkpoints for the safety not only of the community itself, but for non-indigenous people as well. We handed out PPE to everyday people. We were some of the first people to advocate for vaccination. And in fact, we have the highest vaccination rates of any demographic in the United States. Over 95% of indigenous people in the United States have been vaccinated. That's an incredible number, right? Because we understand it impacts us. And we also understand that when we got these vaccinations through our Indian health system, which has historically been a very awful system, it hasn't always quite worked for us. But nonetheless, when we got extra vaccines, we began giving them out to non-indigenous community members because we're not, our generosity goes beyond just our own people. And we, in fact, even in the place that I lived in Albuquerque, the testing sites that were free first and foremost, we're always in the indigenous clinics, the public clinics that were available for everyone. And so in many ways, the kind of health ethic that we have and the scientific ethic that we have in dealing with communicable disease and public health crises far exceeds what the United States could currently do at this particular moment in time. And so I think those are two elements of the indigenous movement that we're trying to work on as the Red Nation, connecting decolonization with climate change and understanding the role that indigenous people play, as well as understanding the need for socialized medicine, ethical medicine that's grounded in our traditions as indigenous people, which includes not just Western science, but we take our lead from countries like Bolivia, who have pioneered new ways of using ancestral knowledge and medicines in their daily practice. And so that's what we hope to accomplish. I appreciate you all listening to this particular presentation. I have much more to say, but I have a limited time to say it. So I thank you very much.